Now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for.
Thank you, Mr.
Hunter.
Deputy Speaker. We're just sorting out our speaking arrangements. That we're just so enthusiastic on this side, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to tackle the government on the deficiencies in this bill. And while we're looking a little bit messy, I know it's bordering on disorderly of me. I do want to recognise my daughter Grace in the gallery this evening, and her very good friends Sophie and Oliver. This is the first time I've had the opportunity to recognise one of my children in the gallery since my maiden speech of 1996. And given that anniversary is just around the corner, it's very nice to do so again today. Grace has just become very famous with an appointment to the local commercial radio station as a journalist, and I get to officially congratulate her as a Member of Parliament this evening. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a very important bill, and the integrity of the 457 visa system is critical to the Australian economy, and therefore we must have confidence in the Australian community in the system as we know it. And it's bordering on outrageous that there is no sanction available under our law for applicants of 457 visas who might seek to bribe, in effect, a sponsor under the relevant Act. And of course, we welcome the fact that the government has agreed to rectify that situation, but as the Shadow Minister has indicated, we believe a lot more needs to be done to further build the integrity of the scheme and to restore public confidence. I won't go through those additional changes. The Shadow Minister has done so quite eloquently, and they are on the record. Now, I represent a mining electorate, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I have a very good grasp of the importance of mining to the Australian economy. And of course, in this place, I'm the spokesman for the opposition on matters agriculture. And of course, as the previous speaker said, there are a few areas in which the integrity of the visa system is more important than agriculture. So I have a deep-seated interest in this subject. We have enough difficulty explaining to the Australian community that from time to time we will need to supplement our skilled labour in this country to do the things we need to further build and diversify our economy. We're a small island continent of just between 23 and 24 million people. Many of the projects that land in Australia, particularly some of the bigger mining projects, again particularly some of the bigger iron ore projects, are very lumpy in their nature. And during the construction phase, as we saw during the recent mining boom, the demand for skilled labour is very, very intense, but short-lived. So there will be times when, by necessity, we will rely upon the importation of skilled labour. And the Australian community, I think, struggles with that concept from time to time. They see a relatively high unemployment rate. They see deficiencies in our vocational education programs and even a lack of competitiveness in our higher education infrastructure, and they struggle to understand why this is necessary, and they have an expectation that their politicians will minimise our reliance on imported skilled labour, and I absolutely understand that. But picking back up on my earlier points, it's the very nature of our country, our population and our economy that from time to time, no matter how much better we do in our skills formation and the improvement in our learning institutions, we will always as a country, in part at least, rely on the importation of skilled labour. So if we're to hope to persuade the Australian people of that point, and if we're to hope to then maintain community confidence in the skilled visa programs, then we must work together to ensure that the integrity of those programs are without question. And this is a concept or a principle which very much apply to the recent debate we had in this place and in the broader community about the China Free Trade Agreement. I think it is a settled issue now that the labour market arrangements under the China Free Trade Agreement were less than optimal. Indeed, they were looser, for want of a better term, than those that were found in other free trade agreements, and those which applied to our skilled migration program generally. And for the opposition to allow or to acquiesce on the China Free Trade Agreement without challenging those provisions would have been a mistake on many fronts. The most obvious being, of course, the impact on the Australian labour market, in other words, the unnecessary displacement of Australian workers by those from other countries when it was obviously unnecessary. But again, of course, the lack of confidence that might have driven, not only in that free trade agreement, but free trade agreements we might enter into as a country in the future. So it was important for the opposition to highlight those deficiencies, to stand its ground, to argue its case publicly, and I think it's settled now that out there in the community the opposition was gaining very broad and majority community support for our campaign to make those changes. But the ongoing building of confidence in the system is the critical point here. You know, the Roy Hill mine was a subject of much debate when we were in government not that long ago. And it's a very good example of the incapacity of a company or an individual investor or a group of investors to progress such a large project without being able to demonstrate to the financiers of that project that not only is the iron ore there and the volume there and the right price for that product likely over the course of maybe the next 2 decades, but it's also necessary for them to be able to persuade their bankers, who might be in London, that they will be able to secure the skilled labour necessary to get the project through the construction phase. And it's very helpful to be able to turn up to a London house and say, well, I have an agreement with the Australian government which assures me that if I'm unable to secure the labour I require, the skilled labour I require in Australia, that I will be, with great certainty, be able to import that labour into Australia. So it's a very small but I think succinct example of the importance of having certainty in the system and why we need to have a 457 visa program. But again, it's also a reminder that if we're to continue to rely upon them, that we do need community confidence, and this amendment that the government's agreed to this evening will go a long way toward that. But again, we believe, more, and we will continue to pursue improvements in the program. Mr Deputy Speaker, I touched on agriculture. I've spoken a little bit about mining. Agriculture is increasingly becoming a capital-intensive activity, and that in many ways is a good thing because it will increase our competitiveness on international markets. The dairy industry, for example, is highly automated these days, but increasingly the skills involved in an agriculture sector that has to go up the value curve to be internationally competitive are increasingly hard to find. And as a country, we need to do more about that locally. The fact is that we have an ageing workforce in agriculture, and the skills infrastructure, the learning institutions which have provided traditionally those skills in the agriculture sector are not getting the interest from applicants that they were in the past. Now, I've always said that young people will come back to agriculture when they think there's a quid in it, and I still believe that is true. But I think there's a role for government to strengthen our learning institutions, our coursework, and those things that will build the skills we need in agriculture if we're not going to be too reliant on the skills of others from other countries in the future. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, the opposition welcomes again the government's decision to support the cause for the sanctions against those who seek to pay sponsors for a 457 visa. But as outlined by the Shadow Minister, we think there's a long way to go yet to produce an optimal outcome in this area of public policy, and we will continue to pursue those in the future.
I thank the member for Hunter.